Okay, John Dove here. We've just had the March session of the Legal Advocacy Club, and tonight our members have been conducting speed mooting. So I'm just going to share some feedback and some hints and tips in relation to mooting. I'm going to start tonight with some common mistakes that I sometimes see in relation to mooting. And one of the key mistakes that I sometimes see is people being too note tied or tied to a script. Now, I'll preface this by saying I don't really see that there's any problem with having a script. You know, if you want to type out a script initially with your submissions, that's no problem whatsoever. And of course, you can use that to practice as you're going along. Where people fall down, and it's quite easy to do these days, particularly when you're doing moots online, as people have done tonight, is you can have the script up on your screen. So you might have half the screen containing a bit of a script there. And, you know, we can follow where your eyes are going. So it's very easy to notice when somebody's reading from a script. And likewise in real life, you know, if you're looking down at a script, I think I mentioned this last week, if you're looking down like this, your voice isn't going to project and it isn't going to carry, and you don't appear as confident. So that's one issue. The second issue, when you're too reliant on a script, is if the judge asks you a question by way of judicial intervention and you then have to move away from that, it can then cause you to be flustered when you then need to go back, or if the judge wants you to move to a different part of your submissions. So the name of the game really is practice, so that when it comes to presenting for real in the moot, you'll come across as a lot more fluid and a lot more dynamic. And a second issue that I sometimes see in relation to moots is sometimes people can add sort of additional facts that might not be in the problem, or additional evidence. So read the moot problem carefully and make sure that you stick to the actual facts and the evidence that are there. And in terms of some pieces of advice, the first thing I would say is try and be authentic, try and be yourself. Now, what I see some people do is try and, you know, they might see a particular advocate that they like and they'll try and imitate them. And for me, this is quite problematic, because if you try and imitate somebody else, you'll never do it, and it never comes across as authentic. And stemming on from that, the other thing that some people try and do is put on this bar voice. You know, they think that they've got to speak with a particular posh accent, which you don't need to. You can speak in your own voice. And I mentioned this last week again. If you're speaking slowly, as you would do when you're presenting in a moot, naturally that's going to sort of change your voice anyway a little bit. When you slow down, it's going to allow you to present with a little bit more clarity. But if you've got an accent, don't hide it. Be yourself, and you'll be a lot more authentic and therefore a lot more persuasive. In terms of general tips for the structure of a moot, at the beginning, just by way of courtesy, you always want to start with the salutation, "May it please the court." Always get that in at the start. It's just common courtesy. And then within your introduction, you want to set out where you're going with the moot. So give the court a little bit of a roadmap. So if you're going to make 3 points, you might want to say, "Your lordships and ladyships, I'm going to be making 3 points within my submissions. And these are," and just simply set out what those 3 or 4 or 5 points, however many points you're going to make, but effectively give the court a roadmap. You're then going to jump into the main body of your submissions. And each time you move on to a new point, always refer back to your skeleton argument. So let's say, for argument's sake, you will have 3 submissions. You know, your first substantive point might be a paragraph 3. So you say, I will now deal with the first submission, which your lordships will find at paragraph 3 of the skeleton argument, and then develop the point from there. Whenever you're making a legal point, always back it up with authority. And of course, as we know, authority comes from case law or legislation. But whenever you're making that point, always back it up with authority. And likewise, if you are going to be referring to a particular piece of case law, unless you've asked for permission from the judge to dispense with formal citations, make sure you cite the case correctly. And if you're going to be referring to a particular paragraph or a particular sentence within a judgment that you think, you know, is particularly important or is going to support your argument, tell the judge exactly where to find that within the bundle. So you might say it's going to be on page 56 of the bundle, fourth paragraph down, at the sentence beginning with the word and let the judge find that. Don't continue your submissions until you're confident that the judge has found where you're directing them to within the bundle. Because if they're still flicking through and you're talking, they're not listening to what you're saying. So make sure that whenever you refer the judge to a particular part of a judgment, let them find it first. And there's certain phrases that you should use as well. So one of the most important ones is if you do feel that you need to preface a sentence, use I submit or it is my submission that. Occasionally I see people say I think or phrases to that extent. If you think, that's opinion. And there's two problems with that. A, you're not there to give an opinion, that you're there to advocate. But secondly, just think about the connotation of that. If it's, well, I think, it doesn't quite have the same substance, it doesn't quite have the same force. Whereas I submit, that's a much more positive phrase. It shows that you're a lot more confident in what you're saying. So make sure that you're using the correct turn of phrase. I talk about this a lot in relation to mooting, but judicial intervention is massively important. And particularly if you're competing in high-level moots, judicial intervention can be the thing that splits the mooters. That can be the deciding point. So I've seen it where judges might see two great mooters. They're struggling to distinguish between the two. And sometimes it can come down to how well the two mooters deal with judicial intervention. Now, of course, you'll never be able to know exactly what questions are coming in advance, but you can always prepare for them. You can always have a good guess of what themes might come up by way of judicial intervention, because you will know the cases that go against you. So the cases that your opponent is going to cite, there'll be particular weaknesses within your argument. And they, of course, are going to be low-hanging fruit for the judges when it comes to judicial intervention. So have a look at those areas of weakness, have a look at the strengths in your opponent's case, and you'll have a good idea of where the questions are going to come. And think about how you will deal with those points. Think about how you would answer those questions when it comes to judicial intervention. Now, of course, let's take the example of, let's say it's a particular case that goes against you. What you might want to do is you might want to look for any dissenting judgments. So you might find obiter dicta within those dissenting judgments, or you might want to look at ways that you can distinguish the facts of that case and say, well, it doesn't quite fit squarely where the case that your opponent is citing doesn't quite fit squarely with the facts of the present case. So try and distinguish the case law that goes against you in any way that you can. Then as you're coming towards the end of your moot, you want to come to the conclusion. And a conclusion doesn't necessarily need to be particularly long. And what I would say is just reiterating in very, very brief form what your strongest points are. And then effectively tell the judge or tell the court what you're asking. So if you're for the appellant, you would ask the court to allow the appeal. Likewise, if you're for the respondent, you would ask the court to dismiss the appeal. And then finally, we started with courtesy. Let's finish with courtesy, unless I can assist your lordships and ladyships any further. And that brings you to the end of the moot. So I hope that you've found those tips helpful.